Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Sally Wheeler, and I'm the Dean of the Australian National University's College of Law, and also ANU's Pro Vice Chancellor for International Strategy. I'm delighted to join you here in Canberra, from Canberra, the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. Our audience tonight comes from across Australia and the world. And let me begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose land we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. While 2020 will be remembered for its disruption on a national and global scale, from the Australian bushfires at the start of the year, the COVID-19 pandemic and other social justice issues, at our college it has been an opportunity to unite and commemorate an important milestone, 60 years of law at ANU. And to celebrate this anniversary, we're proud to host our year-long Law in Focus programme of events. Our informative and timely panel discussions draw on the rich expertise of our legal scholars, alumni, and esteemed thought leaders. And tonight we're discussing an issue that is a regular focus in international news, the rule of law in China. And we're very pleased that you can join us as we explore this topic in depth tonight with our experts. We have a very distinguished panel for you this evening. Yun Jiang, editor of the China Story blog and a producer of China Nate San, a weekly policy-focused China analysis newsletter. ANU law alumni, Helen Jiang, a recent Master in Public Administration graduate and a Fulbright scholar from the Harvard Kennedy School, who served with an Australian diplomat in China, and Dr. Jonathan Lilleblad, a senior lecturer here at ANU Law, whose research focus on rule of law with case studies from human rights and environmental issues. I'm also delighted to introduce this evening's moderator, Dr. Graham Smith, who is a research fellow at the ANU Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. He's also co-host of the award-winning Little Red podcast. So, Graham, please get us started.
Jonathan, let's throw straight to you. It seems like we've been talking about the rule of law forever in sort of the big picture. I mean, it's been a discussion that's been around since I was a wee lad, but that's not the case. I mean, it's a discussion that is fairly recent in historical terms, and it has been through many incarnations. So could you maybe give us a bit of a big picture on this, the discourse around the rule of law and how it's changed over the years?
Yeah, so my purpose is to sort of frame things for the lay audience to sort of help them understand the larger academic discourse about the concept of rule of law and to recognize that there are different interpretations of this concept. And it's a reflection very much of different elements within a much larger, much broader discussion. So my background is specifically coming from law and development as a field. And so a lot of the discourse about rule of law is tied to the evolution or changes in law and development. And so, we look in the post-World War II era, we look or begin largely with the modernization school that was predominant in the 1950s and 60s. And this was tied very much to an aspiration to sort of promote global standards within developing countries. That segued into the 1980s, 1990s, when the focus turned to what became known as the Washington Consensus, which was very much a neoliberal project. And there, the attention was on promoting trade liberalization, free markets, deregulation, and reducing government intervention within society and the markets. Going into the 21st century, the Washington Consensus gave way to the new institutionalist economics. And so there, the focus of this era was largely in good governance and the institutions that were relevant in promoting good governance. And at the moment, we're in another period of transition where there's now an increase in functionalist perspectives that are looking at sort of post-institutionalist concerns about ways of achieving the ends of good governance, but through different sets of institutions that are more sensitive to cultural context. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's given way to a continuum of different kinds of perspectives about rule of law. And so you can visualize in your mind models of rule of law that fall between extremes of what we call the thin definitions of rule of law on one side, and then the thick definitions of rule of law on the other side. So the thin definitions of rule of law, this is where law is meant to serve or facilitate transactions, and so provide stability and order. And so here we get affiliations of schools of thought regarding law and order or rule by law. On the other extreme, with the thick conceptions of rule of law, this is where law is affiliated, or not affiliated, but connected to ideas of democratization, as well as human rights. And so this is something that is quite common with a lot of Western liberal democracies. Now, within this continuum, for the purposes of today, it's what I want to consider, like, how do we place the Chinese notion of rule of law? When I say Chinese, I'm talking specifically about the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. And for that, I take as a cue back to 2012. So in November of 2012, Xi Jinping led the standing committee of the Politburo to a exhibit at the National Museum on the road to revival, which was connected to a review of China's century of great humiliation. So for those of you who are not China specialists, the century of great humiliation, this corresponds roughly to 1839 with the first Opium War, and goes to 1949 with the rise of Maoist China. And this time period within China is affiliated with concerns about subordination to imperialism. So not just imperialism to European powers, but also subordination to American interests, and then also Japan. In addition, it was a period marked by domestic unrest, corruption, ineffectual government. And this is also a time period, incidentally, when China was labeled the sick man of Asia, right? So the implication that I take from this kind of a visit, and it caught my attention as sort of a scholar, a follower of geopolitics, is that this sort of gives clues as what the mindset is of the current regime within China. And that for them to make an effort to make a visit to that kind of an exhibit in 2012 gives an indication as to what their concerns are. And so the concern very much is to overcome humiliation. And so that means that it's about trying to focus on effective government or strong government. It's about reducing corruption. It's about suppressing domestic unrest. And for purposes of today's discussion, it's about resistance to outside ideas. And so this means an exceptionalist notion about rule of law that is resistant to foreign ideas. So this means resistance to Western notions of rule of law, even Asian notions of rule of law. So this is where we deviate from voices that talk about cultural relativism or Asian values. And then arguably even deviates from Chinese debates. So for example, those hosted in places like Hong Kong or Taiwan, and instead points to a very instrumentalist notion of rule of law, where the law is in service of the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, and quite potentially Xi Jinping, since he's now in his position for life. And so this is where I think, as my focus then segues into the rest of the panel and sort of what their interpretation is about what the CCP or Xi Jinping expects, either for rule of law domestically within China, or for rule of law for China on the global scale.
Okay. So, I mean, we've gone all the way back to the Opium Wars there with Jonathan. I wondered, Yun, if you could take us back even further, because obviously China has had a centrally administered state off and on for the best part of 2,000 years. And it has used law, as Jonathan was saying, in an instrumental way to keep the kingdom together against the sort of the centripetal forces, not to get too nerdy there, but that sort of threatened to pull the empire apart. Law has been very central to that. So it had its own indigenous, if you like, understandings of law and philosophies around the purpose of law. Could you maybe walk us through those, particularly those that you think may still have some influence today?
Well, first I will be a little bit cautious about trying to say that China's system now reflects or is a continuation of history from 2000 years ago. But of course, history does matter and history does have influence on the present, but it is a judgment call of whether how much influence 2000 years ago's philosophy has on the current Communist Party system. But so one thing that perhaps the Chinese Communist Party look to when it comes to law is legalist tradition, 法家, which sees law as more of an instrument of coercion, as an instrument where you can rule. So I think it is under that kind of tradition, it is probably described rule by law rather than rule of law. And I think that is an accurate description of the current Chinese system in the People's Republic of China. I think that it is more accurate to describe China, People's Republic of China, as a rule by law system rather than rule of law system. Now, when Xi Jinping came to power, he really emphasized governing the nation in accord with the law. And in Chinese, that is 依法治国. And that is such an emphasis which seems to have appearance of, you know, if we were talk about this, it seems to be referring to the rule of law, and they seem to be taking it quite seriously. And rule of law, 法治, is even included as one of the 12 core socialist values, which is promoted in many places on posters around China. If you go to China, they'll be like, core socialist values. And interestingly, some other core socialist values include 民主, which is conventionally translated to democracy, and 自由, which is freedom. So, you know, democracy and freedom are also supposedly core socialist values along with rule by law. Now, of course, you can go into a very, very, very long and big debate about whether 民主 actually means democracy in the English sense of the word. But governing in accord with the law, however, if you read a lot of those, you know, CCP, Communist Party speeches, Xi Jinping's important speeches, rule or governing in accord with the law cannot contradict the primacy of the CCP leadership in China. So in one of the important speeches actually have a specific meaning in Chinese Communist Party. In one of the important speeches, she emphasized party leadership of governing in accord with the law. So I think it's probably better to say CCP wants to rule by law, with the law being an instrument of coercion or instrument which CCP retains its leadership, and that includes controlling dissent. There is one saying often quoted, is that East, West, South, North, and Center, the party leads everything. And another glaring example of the contradiction is the so-called the opposition, absolute opposition, so-called constitutionalism, which basically just implementation of the China's constitution. Now, if you read the constitution, it says a lot of reasonable things. In fact, China's constitution guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of press, assembly, and demonstration. Those things are not in the Australian constitution. But supposedly China's constitution guarantees that. Now, we know that in many cases, those freedoms do not exist. That freedom of speech is very limited. And the recent changes constitution also, one controversial change was the removal of term limits, which paved the way, as we were saying before that, for Xi to rule for more than 2 terms, which is 10 years. Now, I think it's when you look at rule of law in China, it is quite important to look at the interaction between state legal system and the party system. And one example where that interacts is the high-profile corruption cases that Xi has been doing. So under Xi, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection was quite powerful. It catches both flies and tigers. Tigers being the high-profile ones, and flies being the more junior level cadres. Now, in the case of corruption cases, and one notable example was the case of Bo Xilai. So he was first expelled from the party for violating party discipline, and then handed over to state legal trial. But actually the party discipline investigation, which is so-called 双规, already sealed his fate. So by the time legal trial started, it's basically a formality. And the 双规 process is often done in secret. It's often involves extrajudicial detention and potentially involving torture as well. So I think that's a quite interesting case to compare the party system and the state system. I think another thing to bear in mind is implementation law. So we're talking about rule of law. There's law on the book, and then there's a way that they are implemented. And in many instances where even the law is the same, the administration or implementation can be quite uneven. So on the one hand, the advantage of that is that the implementation is flexible according to local conditions. And that is one reason that the government says why it occurs. But on the other hand, it does provide the government with a plausible deniability of possible discrimination. So one example is in Xinjiang, where uniform ethnic family planning policy was implemented in 2017, which supposedly means that families allow same number of children regardless of ethnicity. But what it in effect means that the family planning policy is actually more strictly enforced for Uyghurs than for Han people. And we know from recent reports that Uyghurs were often sent to jail for having too many children, whereas Han people were spared the jail. Looking forward, there's one interesting development for next year is the Rectification Campaign. Rectification has a long history in the Chinese Communist Party, all the way going back to Yan'an from the early days. And it is quite quite a somewhat a gruesome process can be. It is sometimes involves purges, involves self-reporting, and involves people reporting on each other. And the aim of the target of the Rectification Campaign from next year is going to be on legal and security apparatuses. That includes courts and police forces. And the aim is to root out disloyalty to the party, abusive, corrupt behavior, which basically it makes Xi's control over the security and legal apparatus more comprehensive. So that's the domestic focus. Now, international focus of the rule of law. In international law, I think in that respect, China is a bit more like, it sees itself as a great power in that it follows international law when it's in its interest and then do not follow international law when it's not in interest. So for example, in the case of World Trade Organization, it mostly follows the rulings in trade and economic issues because it is in its interest. And then on the other issues, such as in South China Sea, it does not follow. And I think that's all I have to say on that.
Okay, I'll get myself back off mute. That's the danger of having broadcasts at 6 p.m. It is bedtime and bath time in our house, so there could be a few more interruptions. Now, look, I really should throw to Helen because it's 2 a.m. where Helen is, so I think if we don't get her to say something soon, she might just drift off on us. I mean, Helen, from a practitioner's perspective, the last few days, or maybe the last few weeks have been fascinating and somewhat alarming from an Australian perspective in terms of what's been going on with the Australia-China relations. Without getting into specifics, though, I was fascinated yesterday when the MFA spokesman, Zhao Lijian, who's got often has a very colourful turn of phrase, it was very much, almost every second word was rule of law, rule of law, rule of law. I mean, he was very much about emphasising the importance of law in what was going on, even though it seems to an outsider that it really had nothing to do with law and this was, some fairly arbitrary stuff going on. But I mean, from your perspective, like having worked in the diplomatic corps, has China's understanding, like its domestic understanding of the rule of law, changed since the days of Jiang Zemin, for example? Or is it just a case of China having the means and the capacity to assert itself that it didn't have, say, in the 1990s? Do you think there's been a change in China's understanding of rule of law?
thank you for the question, Graham. And I have to say it's a tough act to follow with these two, particularly at 2 a.m. right here. I think in response to your question, though, and I am saying this as a student and a sort of recently graduated student, not as an official, I do think that China's stance, building on what Yunjiang has just said, and its sort of worldview is largely informed by its growing status and growing assertiveness in the more global world stage. So I think I wanted to talk about this when sort of zooming out and looking at the broader geopolitical context of how, you know, from two issues in particular of how the CCP has managed to apply the sort of their understanding and interpretation of rule of law against international standards. So the first thing I wanted to look at is sort of how they have done this domestically in China, and several issues that have drawn attention. The first is the Xinjiang issue, where we've seen recently there are much more purpose-built high security camps, some of which are, you know, capable of housing tens of thousands of people, and it really signals a shift away from the makeshift use of public buildings that we saw before. And I think the reason why China has been able to sort of been, able to get away with this in one sense is because that they have been able to exert more economic leverage internationally. And then, you know, building on that, looking at the Hong Kong national security laws that have come to pass, even though these laws have always been something that Hong Kong was meant to have in the basic law under Article 23, they've struggled to pass this because it was so unpopular. But now instead, we've seen that there is Beijing can enact laws against treason, secession, sedition, and a whole bunch of anti-Beijing crimes, that some of which can be even tried outside of Hong Kong jurisdiction. So this has had a severe impact on freedom of expression and what some critics see as an erosion of the judicial independence in Hong Kong. And of course, this again goes back to the fact that what Yunjiang and also Jonathan have touched on, the fact that China is able to assert itself on the global stage, which means that they are more able to flex sort of their interpretation of the rule of law. And then, of course, finally, this very topical issue and very serious issue of hostage diplomacy, which is what we've seen with, some term this hostage diplomacy, but we've seen this with very live cases that are going on in China right now, and the recent expulsion of 2 Australian journalists, which means that there's now no journalists present in China since, there has been continuous presence from 1973, and this is the first time we've seen a break in that. And so what that signals is that there is probably very significant difficulties for future Australian journalists to be able to get accredited to operate in China, and probably, I think, results in a lesser level of understanding from Australian journalists trying to report on Chinese issues and things that are not even political in nature. But of course, this is all caught up and embroiled in the broader bilateral relations, which have been tense, to say the least, in recent years or in recent months. And then the second sort of big issues I wanted to touch on was China's influencing of the international order. And so this is picking up on what Yunjiang was talking about in terms of the application of CCP interpretation of rule of law in the international context. So the framing of this is that, as Jonathan has already touched on, there is a trend for China to begin asserting itself into areas that it has more traditionally played an observer role in. This includes sort of in the United Nations context and also on issues of human rights. And it reflects, I think, China's desire to provide an alternative model that does not imitate Western values per se. So, for example, China's support of countries which want to speed up their development while preserving their sovereignty and independence. So there are 4 main ways of influencing the international order, and a lot of this I have drawn from former US Ambassador Sam Power former US ambassador to the UN, Sam Power, and her writings on this issue. So the first way of influencing is, of course, by example, as China provides a successful or relatively successful model of authoritarian capitalist governance. So, you know, the understanding that democracies will necessarily bring economic development is and not necessarily a tried and tested model anymore. And I think China has definitely complicated this argument with its economic development in recent years, combined with, you know, global backlash against inequality in some democracies. And so what this translates to is that some foreign leaders rely on the Chinese model to perhaps exert a rule by law as opposed to rule of law in their jurisdictions in order to maintain power or to seek sort of economic challenges that can be drawn from Chinese inspiration. And then the second way that China has influenced international standards is as an enabler. So in the sense that it has enabled certain capabilities for other countries to enhance their internal security tools, and some of which are used by fellow governments to repress their citizens. So, for example, China exports its vast arsenal of technology, including AI surveillance, as well as initiatives along the digital Silk Road that could bring in sort of increased guidance and internet controls. This, whilst not necessarily always intentional, it does, in essence, enhance repressive capabilities of certain countries that have been deemed, you know, under sanctions in the UN system. And then the third way is that China is also an active and proactive intervener in the international system. And I know that this is probably subject to a lot of debate, and there are critics who disagree with this view, but I think that China has now got a significant and growing capacity to influence political developments inside other countries, including influencing state, public, corporate views, and also practices. China's leverage, which, you know, can be used as tools to seek to affect political developments in other countries, and this might be economic leverage, military leverage, and other ways that I suppose coercions that can deem an outcome that's favourable to Chinese national interests. And I think when there are things, as Yun had mentioned, that touch on China's core interests and is beneficial for China's core interests, then you see an increased propensity to engage in foreign interference. And then finally, moving on to the final one, is that China is also becoming a norm shaper in the international system, which I think is very important because it sets precedents for the broader international liberal order. And as we see, China is now the second most powerful country in the United States, not in the United States, in the United Nations. And just falling behind the US, but it has overtaken Japan in terms of its funding and donations to the UN. And so with that financial leverage, you see a lot of bureaucratic and political power attached to China's influence. So it now is, I think there's been a trend, as people who work in the international systems can see, of China having a vested interest in thickening the idea of sovereignty and the shield of sovereignty to ensure that certain countries or countries in general are insulated from international law or criticisms of internal practices, such as human rights practices. And in addition to that, we see that China is increasingly more, I guess, comfortable with threatening countries that disagree with the way that they have operated, and have pushed for the UN to return to a more statist forum where there is less inclusivity from civil society. And so this all sort of goes back to China's will to have a very traditional interpretation, conservative interpretation of the idea of national sovereignty, which weakens sort of the ability for external parties to scrutinise practices inside of in internal affairs in those countries. And then finally, I know I'm probably coming up on time. I think with this, China has also had increased leverage on the United Nations Security Council alongside Russia, where we've seen there's been a sort of trend towards less, I suppose, sorry, not less, more a more will to sort of push back against sovereignty and sort of interference in sovereignty. And this goes back to China's financial clout as well as its broader rising global geopolitical power status. I mean, what this means for the rest of the world is something that I'm also happy to go into to discuss, Graham, but I'm also happy to flip it back to you and for you to navigate this discussion.
I'm tempted to ask a cheeky question at this point, and I'll throw this to both Yun and to Jonathan to debate. Isn't China just doing what great powers do, in the sense that, particularly when it looks at the behaviour of what was for a while the only superpower, which very selectively chose which international laws it would follow and which ones it would not sign up to? Isn't China, to a certain extent, just doing what it thinks a great power should do, and in many ways assert itself outside the accepted norms, as the other superpower very often does? Jin, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yes, I would actually agree with that. Although, in Australia, we talk about rules-based order, but when you look at the history of a liberal international rules-based order, and you look at the behavior of some countries, such as the United States, what it does is it often, also go against the rules-based order, and it has supported dictatorships around the world in its fight against communism, for example. So I think we, perhaps in Australia, from Australia's standpoint, we look a bit too favorably upon the liberal rules-based order and tend to ignore some of the more problematic parts. And whereas if you were coming from a standpoint of someone in the Middle East or in South America, then perhaps their view of the liberal rules-based order will be quite different. So if we look to take through that kind of a point of view, then I think China is doing what all great powers do, which is, one, influencing the rules, influence the world order, and two, do things, obey the world rules-based order, obeying order where it is in its interest and discard it when it's not. And unfortunately, the trend from the United States, the trend is also going against the other way. We're seeing recently the sanction being placed on International Criminal Court by the United States. That is quite a concerning development as well.
Jonathan, would you like to take that up, and possibly with reference to the South China Sea, because I know we shouldn't, we can't get through a discussion of rule of law internationally without mentioning that particular dispute.
Yeah, I mean, well, first, just to provide some transition from Yun's comments, and it's very true that anyone who follows realist perspectives about international relations and the history of geopolitics will be very mindful of the fact that all great powers in some way have advanced their own interests within the international system. And so as much as in the post-World War II era, the United States talked about an international order and tried to promote international institutions and international norms, it also had a proclivity based on particular presidential administrations to pursue very specific kinds of interest and to actually claim certain amounts of exceptionalism from the international law. Having said that, as a proponent as a human rights scholar, as an environmental scholar, one of the things I will point out is that in the post-World War II era, there was also very much parallel efforts to create universal consensus about a sense of human rights, or a sense of environmental norms. And so that, there are arenas within the international system where have been attempts over time and arguably some measure of progress to create, for lack of a better term, an international rule of law, right? That, international system where international actors comply to agreed upon rules and norms of behavior. Now, is China going to participate in that, or is it going to go its own way? The way things are currently, it's very clear that there's sort of an exceptionalist attitude. And so that you can see that playing out in the various cases that both Yun and Helen have raised. And this is where we're turning to the South China Sea, that it's very apparent that China has its own perspectives on that. And that as much as there was an international arbitration that ruled against China, or at least the PRC, continues to oppose the arbitration judgment. What I would want to point out as a result of this, since we're talking about the South China Sea, I think it raises a relevant issue: is how does the rest of the world respond to China? And how does the rest of the world respond to a Chinese or a Communist Party or Xi Jinping interpretation of rule of law domestically or internationally? And so, this is where I think it becomes very critical to sort of be mindful as to what the mindset or rationale is of the international order. So, I'll point specifically back to the early 1990s, 1994, when Bill Clinton delinked human rights from the granting of most favored nation status, trading status to China, which I think sent off significant messages to the leadership in China that human rights was not necessarily part of an international rules-based order and not part of an American foreign policy regarding trade. So those kinds of signals are definitely problematic, because it certainly feeds into the elements within China that sort of see a thin version of rule of law, that sort of want to assert instrumentalist interpretation, that law is just simply in service of the interests of whoever's in power. And so these kinds of actions on the international scale, I think, are very much problematic.
I'm going to throw to Helen now. One thing that I've been thinking about over the conversations we've had the last couple of weeks is, from a diplomatic perspective, China's very clear about what its core interests are, and they include things such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, territorial integrity, and down the line, probably Taiwan, which by some estimates may be retaken within the next decade. Now, how does a multicultural middle power like Australia navigate that? Because we have Xinjiang citizens, we have Hong Kong citizens, we certainly have Taiwanese citizens. How on earth do you go about navigating that? China is very clear about this. It's a principle that they will not shift on, and yet it's also in the interests of some members of our community. So how on earth can you navigate that?
Yeah, sure. Wow, you throw all the easy balls at me, Graham. I think that's a really tricky one to answer. But, Graham, you mentioned that China is very clear about its core interests. And I do think that Australia has increasingly become more assertive about our core interests as well. And I think that also, in addition to pertaining to our economic interests, we're increasingly more emboldened to express where our political red lines may be as well. And so I think there's an understanding that domestically we must look out for the interests of the Chinese and or Asian diaspora, including the Taiwanese and Hong Kong and also Xinjiang minorities who are here. And you've seen recently that the Australian government has looked to offer will grant visa status to some Hong Kong students who are in Australia to ensure that they can be in this country. And so I think as a policy, it's very difficult to sort of, I guess, implement very cleanly because we are so economically tied to China. So I think the solution is not necessarily a bilateral one, but one that will involve the alliance of other like-minded countries and our allies. And it's only when democracies and those with shared values speak in chorus that I think that we're able to really send a message clearly to China on those issues. And so it's a tricky one. There's no sort of, silver bullet to this. It's a very tricky issue to manage.
Just to follow up on that, this phrase, like-minded nations, becomes tricky in that, a lot of the nations we think of as like-minded, and indeed at times our own nation, are showing authoritarian tendencies of our own. Certainly Modi's India, you would be reluctant to say some of the things that his party stands for are in the ballpark of what we would think about as sort of liberal democracy. But how do you manage that when the illiberal tendencies seem to be spreading well beyond China and into countries that advertise themselves as democracies?
Yeah, another softball.
That's my specialty.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that we do see, you're right, there is a trend internationally of liberal democracies that pertain to be these liberal democracies when in fact are ruled by sharp power or have had a lot of authoritarian tendencies. But I think that the key to this is that you have to continue to engage with these countries, because I think the trend of pulling away from the international system results in a more detrimental impact overall on liberal democracies and the liberal world order, which, as Jonathan rightly pointed out, deserves some, reflection and sort of, I think, reform in many ways. But Australia must continue to have dialogues with our like-mindeds and countries who are liberal democracies in order to, uphold the international system. But I think this touches on a broader issue of misinformation and disinformation, and a lot of authoritarian powers who are using technology to leverage political power and to sway populations into, believing certain more populist and nationalist tendencies. But that might be a discussion for another day. I don't know if we've got time to touch on that.
Look, I'm going to give it a go, but I've been itching to throw to Yun about something she touched on very quickly. And I think it's really kind of key to how China is different now to the China of the good old days of Jiang Zemin, when the country seemed to be heading in a very different direction. And the thing you mentioned was core socialist values is something that was popping up on posters all over China. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's core socialist values are actually being written into law in China. And it's something that people really don't quite have an understanding of. And at its base, Xi Jinping's made this very interesting series of speeches, if you're willing to wade through them all. And he's not hostile to Western democracy in the sense that his attitude is basically, yeah, that works for them, that gives them a stable system, and you can change government without any troubles. But that won't work for us. What we need is this thing, and it's called socialist values. So could you spell out what they are and what it means for them to be written into law? Like, this is the Constitution and laws themselves are being having this hardwired into them.
I am ashamed to say I cannot recite all 12 of the core socialist values. I am very sorry. So why? I guess one thing that is interesting with Xi's rise to power is that I think, sorry to get into a bit too much domestic politics, is that he seems to see himself as quite different from the past few rulers. He sees himself more as a, not just a continuation, but quite a change. So what we see is that changing constitution, putting his name onto specific projects and writing them into constitution or into specific laws. And I think core socialist value is one part of that. It's where Xi can put his stamp on a specific thing, such as another example is Belt and Road project, Belt and Road initiative. That is another one that is quite closely associated with Xi's project. And what he has also done is that he's, almost erased the last two leaders. There's almost a sense that he's going to be the new Mao almost. So I think the importance of that is he's basically starting this almost a whole new brand new project of a nation building, of rejuvenation of the nation, getting the people to see himself as something that is greater than just a continuation of norm, but more of a break from the past.
Now I can see we've got quite a backlog of questions to the audience. I'm going to throw one final quick one to the panel. And that is, we've been talking a lot about China as an amorphous entity, but I wondered if some or all of you would like to unpack it a little bit. For example, when Jonathan, you were talking about this export of surveillance, it's often Chinese companies that are leading the way in that, rather than the Chinese state per se. And you know, autocracy is profitable, if you like, in many cases when you're talking about surveillance capitalism. Facebook understands that very well, as does Google, and certainly Alibaba is right in there with the Smart Cities program, exporting it far more effectively than the Chinese state could ever manage to do. I mean, would any of you like to have a crack at the role of Chinese corporations in the rule of law project, and where do they sit? Because certainly the attitude of Australian companies seems to have shifted over the last few years. Usually, so if you can go back 3 years, Australian companies would jump up and down as soon as the government said anything negative about China. Now it's the case that they generally stay fairly quiet. There's a few outliers like Twiggy Forrest, but generally the Australian companies have come on board with the government's view, or at least aren't challenging the government in public. So how's that working in China? Like, are Chinese companies buying into this rule of law project? An easy one again. Who wants to have a crack?
Who is going first? I'll go first. Well, compared to countries like Australia, China has the PRC government, or the Chinese Communist Party, has a much greater influence on Chinese companies, and especially big corporations, as well as companies in sensitive sectors, and that includes things in telecommunications, such as Alibaba, as you mentioned, Tencent, and Baidu. So in Chinese corporation, how do they interact with the rule of law? I guess I want to talk about how it interacts with domestic politics. So China's system is more like a state capitalism system, in that state has more influence over companies, but also companies has more influence over the state as well. In that, a lot of big companies, they have party cells, but then also a lot of, especially big state corporations, big state-owned corporations, the head of those big state corporations have a actual formal role in the party system or in the state system as well. So those two are quite interlinked. They influence each other. In terms of when they go overseas, then that can encounter a bit of a trouble, because when we assess foreign investment from especially state-owned enterprises from China, then we have to consider their role in the Chinese party system, in the Chinese state system. And because of their close interconnection with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, we would have to assess them in a different way than if they were just, a pension fund or a private company that is totally unrelated to the state.
Yeah, and I think just building up on what Yun has said, obviously the glaring one we haven't mentioned is 5G and Huawei, and the fact that there is a very clear, arguably very clear link between the CCP's strategic purposes and strategic aims, having deemed Huawei a national champion back in the 90s, when I think the CEO Ren had just started the company, and we see a lot of issues with the dual use technologies of civilian military technologies, which has come under the wrath of the US government in recent months. But I think more broadly, you do see a trend of industry bodies, like, for example, AmCham. And I don't know if the sentiment is as strong in Australia, but certainly here in the US, there is a big push back against from foreign corporations against Chinese corporations because of the intelligence laws that can compel companies to share information with the CCP. Now, whether or not that's actually implemented or whether or not companies act on that is a different matter. So there's definitely solid proof for some of the US allegations, but there is certainly a suspicion, increasing suspicion and sentiment against trusting Chinese corporations, certainly here on this side of the Pacific.
Yeah, we had someone on the podcast earlier this year that looked a lot like you and who said Australia and China have very different views on that because Australia is a net IP consumer, whereas the US is a net IP producer. So in many ways, we tend to take China's position because we don't make a lot of IP. Sorry, Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, no worries. So just to follow both on what Yoon and Helen have said, there's another component to this as well. And so, and this is something that you'll hear from certain voices within the Chinese government, is that they'll point out that, the United States is no different in terms of how corporations are advancing certain kinds of US interests. It's just that they're doing it in a different way. And so specifically, one of the examples is like, the following 9/11, there was the implementation and rollout of different kinds of accounting mechanisms and different ways of tracking financial flows, FATCA, et cetera. And so this is where a situation where the United States was sort of utilizing its power to sort of advance, not through military, not through coercive mechanisms, but very much through economic arrangements, sort of a US set of interests. Having said that, one thing I will concur with Yoon and Helen on is that when you're dealing with China, that it's very much state-owned enterprises that are engaged in overseas affairs. And so there's always very much that question mark as to how much the Chinese state is involved with a lot of Chinese corporate activity. And this becomes much more disturbing when you consider things like WeChat or WePay or these kinds of things, where China is trying to create its own ecosystem of technology. And so, for example, Facebook is not something that a lot of my colleagues in China have access to. There's very much concerns about surveillance of those kinds of mechanisms. If they're going to be engaging in activities like WeChat, WePay, then everyone sort of has to recognize that there's very much the possibility of surveillance, and including this notion of like social credit scores, and the implications of that in terms of like freedom of movement, freedom of travel, those kinds of things. In which case, the responsibility for the rest of the world is on the rest of the world to respond, right? And so this goes back to the old maxim is that, the camel that enters the tent is going to keep moving forward until the owner of the tent, says no. So it's up to the rest of the world to then sort of decide what they're going to do. And I think like one of the questions that I see on the propositions, hopefully all three of us have answered some of these questions already, but there's one question as to what can small powers do in response to the activities of China. Well, I think it's already happening. I mean, you see, my situation with the research I do in Southeast Asia, you see countries in Southeast Asia, they're increasingly paying greater attention to the terms of deals under the Belt and Road Initiative, paying much greater attention to the proposals being given by Chinese corporations, and doing much more vetting about the terms of business deals. And in some situations, even rejecting them. Right. And if they can, it's a choice of like, well, everyone complains about the Americans, everyone complains about the West, everyone complains about the Europeans, but who would they rather do business with at the end of the day? And so you see these kinds of choices playing out. And so for a country like Australia, this is where I think that it becomes relevant to consider what is the Australian vision? How does Australia offer an alternative to the Chinese expectations? Right.
All right. Now we've already dipped into questions, but I'm going to start with the very first question in our Q&A list because it's nice and tight and manageable. Does any panelist have a view about the detention of lawyers in the People's Republic of China and how citizens inside China view this practice? Who wants to have a crack at that?
I can't answer the question about how citizens view lawyers in China. That's, I think only someone who's inside the country can give a current answer on that. I think that question is referring to the fact that there's a large number, well, when I say large, more than 300 human rights lawyers who are currently under detention. And, as any supporter of universal human rights would, be alarmed by this presence. But as one of the other questions posed, is, China is a member of existing human rights treaties. It's ratified a number of human rights treaties, not the Iccpr, but certainly a number of the other human rights treaties. And yet it's engaging in practices that from the outside seem to contradict that. So number of points that I would sort of make on this and also regarding the human rights treaties aspect is that I think, once again, this is a reflection of the desire to sort of give a Chinese interpretation about international institutions, about international norms. This includes things like human rights. It's very much centered on something that's about restoring stability, order, these kinds of things. So human rights lawyers that are perceived as being activists would very much probably be seen as problems, right? And this is not something, incidentally, that's exceptional to China. This is something that's very much consistent with the rest of Asia, where for the better part of the 20th century, most of Asia was seen as an incredibly unstable place, incredibly violent. And so anything that might be perceived as encouraging activism, unrest, disorder, these kinds of things, throughout most of the countries in Asia have been perceived with very negative responses. And, regarding the human rights treaties, you can see that China is very much trying to say, okay, look, we recognize, these concepts of human rights, these treaties, but we're going to insist on a particular interpretation that we think is appropriate for us. And so this is consistent with the annual report issued by China, the white paper where they criticize the United States human rights record, right? And this is very much, I think, meant for a global audience to show that China is pushing back and that they want to present their own conception of what it means to have human rights on an international stage.
You have to be very brave to be a human rights lawyer in China, I think. And I do admire those people who continue to fight despite the difficulties in such a system. In terms of the second one, how citizens in China view this practice, well, so when human rights lawyers are arrested, they're not, the state media and the Chinese media, of course, they're censored, do not usually advertise as, a lawyer arrested because of human rights activism. What they usually do is put some other crimes upon them. For example, common ones are picking quarrels and causing trouble. That's a very common criminal charge. Another one is soliciting prostitution. There's a lot of soliciting prostitution charges as well for some reason. So what usually happens is they get charged for a specific crime, and then there will be things like forced confessions. That's another, I would say, a common tactic. So that when you watch the news, you see, okay, someone get arrested for picking quarrels and has confessed to the crime and then got sentenced to jail. And unfortunately, a lot of people will, I would guess a lot of people would just go with that and believe that.
Yeah, I mean, and there's not much to build on from what Jonathan and Yun have already said, but I think that it then creates a trend of self-censorship and a lot of people who would be then reluctant to engage in human rights lawyers and even fight the issue because there is such a sort of atmosphere that they're not going to succeed in any claims. So it's a problem.
Okay, now there's a great question here, a short take on it if possible, because it could be a lecture in itself. It's from John Eckegren, and he asks, regarding the flexibility of implementation of Chinese law, is this more reflective of China's own history and culture of law, or is this more a trait of Leninist states? Which one do you go with?
Graham, can you repeat that last part? Sorry.
Sure. So he's asking whether the flexibility of implementation of Chinese law is more reflective of China's own history and culture of law, or is it more a trait of Leninist states, the fact that China is a Leninist state?
I think flexibility in terms of implementation of law is not a uniquely Chinese feature either. Even in Australia, in a lot of other countries, even though there's a law on the books, in common law system, you can people get sentenced differently. People get different punishments and penalties. Depends on the circumstances. In terms of China, there is. I guess there is a push sometimes to push into different implementation at the locality levels, and sometimes it has some in a bit more funny ones are including like trash collection, and the more serious ones, as I was mentioning before, is about family planning. So those type of things are quite, I guess, common in China, but also I don't think that's a uniquely Chinese feature either. But what the Chinese system do is that because China is such a big place, and then there's provinces, city administration, and autonomous regional administration, so that different localities, different regions can be almost a test site. You can almost do A/B testing on China and see which one works. I think Deng was saying, going through the river by, I can't remember the exact word now, going through the stone, feeling the stones. I think that's probably also another motivation for doing flexible implementation of such things.
Either of you like to have a crack at that?
Sorry, Greg.
No, just if you'd like to have a crack.
Oh, yes. I think that what we also have to add is that in addition to what Yun has just said, I think there is a very distinct link between Xi Jinping thought and the Leninist way of thinking. So I do think that in response to the question, there probably tends to be more of a skew towards Leninist thinking than traditional Chinese interpretations of rule of law or rule by law. But that's more sort of in line with the party policies that we've discussed earlier in this panel.
And I think the next question is very much for Jonathan. It's from Kevin Ryan. He asks, is China's non-ratification of the Iccpr likely to have any significance in the way Western democracies may engage with China, particularly where trade appears to be a lever to which China may take notice?
Yeah, I mean, so this goes back to my earlier point that, one of the things that I think has been somewhat questionable regarding the Western approach to China was that it's the step in the 1990s. So this is following the Washington Consensus that led to the delinking of human rights from trade. And that, so basically the signal that it was possible to have globalization, international trade, and with respect to, from the Chinese perspective, development, without having to incorporate, a Western notion or Western conceptions about rights, particularly in this, for the purposes of this discussion, individual liberties like free speech, freedom of assembly, et cetera. And so it's a situation where even though it may have been included within the Constitution for purposes of the party, the Communist Party, it's not something that's considered a priority. And so I think that as much as there can be efforts now to try and restore that linkage, it's in a situation, one of the other questions raises this about the ideology trap, is that, yes, China very much now is at a scale in terms of people, wealth, international stature, where, in any attempt to leverage international trade, international relations on behalf of the ideals of something like the Iccpr is just not going to have the same effect it might have had 20 years ago or 30 years ago, right? And so I think, again, this is probably one of the legacies that we have to deal with as a result of the Washington Consensus.
I think you answered 2 questions for the price of 1 there, Jonathan. That's, well done. We'll get through them all at this rate. I'm going to throw this one to Helen in keeping with this tradition. And you will answer this strictly in your personal capacity, Helen. Your DFAT hat will be nowhere to be seen. Thank you for your informative presentations. Wondering, does any panelist have any thoughts concerning Hong Kong's current national security law and the promised one country, two systems back in 1997? What do you think is the future of Hong Kong's democracy, and what should Hong Kong do next?
I mean, I think the short answer to that is that Hong Kong is very strapped in terms of what it can do next. I think economically, Hong Kong will still continue to hum along as the Asian regional financial hub with, the largest offshore RMB holdings, as well as a lot of financial holdings of CCP members who are actually in Hong Kong. So it will still continue to play an important role economically, financially in the region. But of course, politically, this is really tough to answer. But I think there has been a gradual erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy in the years leading up to what we've seen with the national security law. So I think that wasn't necessarily a change that happened overnight, but it is actually symptomatic of the gradual erosion of Hong Kong's political freedoms that were enshrined in the one country, two systems, at least for another couple of decades, which we will see Hong Kong struggling to deal with now. And, we've seen it's lost its special status with the US treaties. And politically, I think anecdotally, you hear that people are very worried about their digital footprint and what they've said in our online forums or sort of in chats. And so I do think that it's the future of the territory or the special administrative region has probably been, its autonomy and political independence has been eroded, and there's not a lot that Hong Kong can do to sort of turn back the years and reverse the effects of the national security laws. And I think how that will play out is something that remains to be seen, because we saw that the chief of the founder of Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, and the way that he had been detained probably isn't a good signal or indicator of how these laws will be applied in practice. But it's still early days, and I think this is one to watch for sure.
Yeah, we actually had Jimmy on our show just before he was arrested. So I recommend you have a listen to that. He certainly was fairly prophetic in his words, and I think he knew what was coming. The next question I'm going to throw to Yun. It's from Chelsea Jiang. Do you think the trends of Australian laws have shifted to mirror what China has been doing? An example is Australia's Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Amendment Bill 2020 gives ASIO significant power in compulsory questioning and to detain people with a very low threshold. So do you think China is affecting our laws? Yun.
I think there is a trend towards securitization. There's a trend towards using national security legislation for a lot of different purposes and giving power to national security agencies. But I don't think that's because of influence from China or even foreign interference. It's definitely not the case of foreign interference. I don't think the intention for that is to become more like China. However, there is certainly a worrying trend that in Australia and in some other countries that it seems that in order to compete with China, we are doing things that is more like China. And I'm talking about things such as in terms of national security legislations, giving more powers to national security agencies, and also we're looking also more at censorship and propaganda and things like that. And not just in Australia, I'm talking about other countries such as the United States. There seems to be a clear trend towards a more of a less liberal kind of system. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to throw the next one to Jonathan. I'm not just rotating it around like it's like playing soccer, but this is very Jonathan, this question. It's from Arushi Neta, who asks, how can sovereignty and political independence of developing and least developed nations be protected within the international system of rule of law when such nations are increasingly economically dependent on the PRC, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, etc.? Can it be perceived as a newer version of territorial expansion? Nice, easy one.
Yeah. So I alluded to parts of this earlier. Okay, so two different ways to do this. One is that if you're very much sort of a realist, neo-realist, you're going to look at this or frame this in terms of a question as to what can an individual state do in response to a rising power or great power, right? And what are the weapons or tools or strategies that are available to a weaker state versus a stronger state? And so this is where you get into discussions about hard power, soft power, smart power, those kinds of things. And so I alluded to the fact that within Southeast Asia, to a certain degree, these kinds of strategies were already being pursued, and that there was a much greater level of diligence being paid now by smaller countries regarding Belt and Road initiatives and even tenders that were being addressed by Chinese corporations. Philosophically, there's another approach when this is more the liberal, neoliberalist sides. And so I think this is what the question was sort of also alluding to, is a question about, is it possible to still maintain an international order that sort of protects the weak against the strong, right? And well, yes. And this was in part what the Human Rights Project was about in terms of having an international system of human rights. And sort of that mindset that existed heading up until about the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the early part of the 21st century, when it was very much an effort to sort of create a globalized system across different issue spaces. Unfortunately, we are living in an era within the past 5 or 6 years where certain countries that were leading that project are suddenly stepping away from that. And so this is where I think that this is one of the unfortunate consequences of the populist wave that has taken over much of the world, that in sort of reacting against an international order, against perceptions of global inequality, it's also undoing a lot of the efforts that have been promulgated to try and actually limit or constrain the actions of great powers versus smaller powers. And that it ironically had also been meant to try and address the questions of inequality. And so this is a situation where, I'm sure that the audience, just like us, is very much sort of living through this wave of history right now. And this is one of the great difficulties that we'll have to address going forward.
So my co-host always pressures me to ask one final big question at the end. Luckily, David's written it for me. So 30 seconds from each of you. In response to, I'm going to edit the question slightly. Do any of the panelists believe that there will ever be rule of law rather than rule by law in the PRC? 30 seconds.
I think history may appear to be predictable from hindsight, but is when you are living through it, it's quite often unpredictable. Yes, there is a possibility that things will always change. So even though the chance of that happening is small right now, things can change in the next decades, centuries.
I'm going to be siding with Yun on this one and be optimistic in my overall take. I think that what we've seen is that economic growth in China really sort of builds to the CCP's power base and their control over the country, and therefore the rule by law rather than rule of law. And we've seen that the growth it's still growing, but it's at its lowest rate in 30 years. So, with how we've seen 2020 play out, who knows what the next 10 or 20 years will bring.
Yeah, I mean, so my take is very much more along the lines as a student of history and, watching the nature of regime change over the course of centuries, right? And, one of the things that's been fairly consistent is that any ruler or great ruler can expand in power, right? And that happens. But eventually, there's always the question of John Locke and the social contract. And you can only deal with dissension and unhappiness within the population for so long. And at some point, if there's a sufficient mass of people who are not happy, particularly if there's certain, incredibly widespread high levels of inequality with accompanying dissatisfaction with the regime as the agent responsible for that inequality, they're going to respond and they're going to act. And if the populace is not satisfied with the regime, then they're going to turn to something that's an alternative to the regime. And you saw this with the French Revolution, you saw this with the Bolshevik Revolution, you saw this even with the Maoist Revolution. And it's these kinds of things that eventually there's always going to be the situation as to, well, what do the Chinese people think and what do they want? Is the current regime able to respond to that? And if they're not, then they'll simply have to follow the trend that's been played out throughout history, for better or for worse.
We're at time, but all that's left is to thank Helen, Yun, and Jonathan for joining us. It's been a real privilege, and I hope we've used your time well. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Graham, for moderating. You've been great.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks to Yun and Helen as well. This was a pleasure.